Morning, everyone. So it's 10 o'clock and we always like to try and start on time just to be respectful of everybody's time. And gosh, we have a good one today. I am going to give Heather her very formal introduction in a moment, but I said to Heather when I spoke to her a few weeks ago that I was a bit of a Heather Hart stalker and just went to events just to hear her speak many times. So Heather, it's a huge privilege to have you here with us today. I don't think there was anyone in this space before or after that's come close to revolutionising revenue and meetings and events. So I am really super excited to hear you speak today. And you've broken a record. We had 268 people, I think, register for this webinar, which is our best so far. So a lot of interest in this subject. So we're really looking forward to getting started. But I guess there's a lot of people who have registered, obviously, to hear a little bit about you, but just so that you kind of get some context of who we are and why we're putting these webinars together. So this is our second series of what we're calling Revenue Ready. We did one before Christmas, and we have one more to go in this series, which is next Tuesday. Then we're taking a break for 1 week, and then we've got our third and final series kicking off with the wonderful Michael Hayward in a couple of weeks' time. But we're putting these out here to the industry really to help, to try and educate people, to try and give them, a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of support from inspirational speakers such as Heather. But just to let you know who we are a revenue management software solution. So we do full revenue management, we integrate with property management systems, we do great forecasting, great data, time saving, all the usual things that you get in a revenue management solution. So our system was born really, I guess, from me being a revenue manager for over 20 years. We wanted to really find a solution that was going to help independent hoteliers kind of remove the myth of that sort of big complicated data and just get down to useful data. So that's who we are. We are a software solution, but this is the educational slant that we try and put on our business as well, with mentoring and support. So Heather, we are delighted to have you. I'm going to read, if you don't mind, so I don't miss anything out on how wonderful you are. So for those of you who don't know Heather, Heather has worked for a wide variety of hotel companies, predominantly in London and the UK, but also spent 2 years in America and included working for Forte, Holiday Inn, Radisson, Goldman and Initial Style conferences. Throughout this time, she gained years of diverse experience in rooms management, systems training, sales and marketing and revenue management in both rooms and meeting and events at hotel and group level. Heather established an excellent track record in commercial management and has been both technically and process driven. And this led her to establish RevXL, her own revenue management consultancy. RevXL delivered clear, pragmatic expertise to implement, develop and enhance the performance of hospitality businesses through the application of simple revenue management principles. But focusing more on meetings and events, and you were frustrated, and I totally understand where that comes from, by the lack of tools and technology to support this aspect for the business. Heather developed a training program, toolkit of spreadsheets, and to focus on M&E strategy, and went on to create Smart Space, a groundbreaking meeting and event strategy tool. Smart Space was acquired by Ideas in 2017, and Heather has remained with the company for 2 years, but has now returned to working freelance. So I guess, Heather, the synergy between both of us is we were working in the industry, saw a need to do something in a space that we felt was a little bit neglected, and then went into software. So we've kind of gone through that transition in the same way. But Heather, delighted to have you today. I'm going to let you kick off, but just one thing I would say to everyone: the magic happens when the conversation starts. So if you'd like to put any questions into the little chat box, I will moderate those and ask Heather as we go along. So please feel free to put anything into the little chat box. Heather, I'm going to let you kick off. I'm going to stop talking and let you kick off.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And it's delighted to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me on. As Adrian mentioned, RevExcel was my consultancy for many years, and one of the reasons I've just popped that on the slide there is one of the kind of strap lines that I kind of work to is this kind of idea of process, strategy, people, and culture. So obviously the basics of the actual process and strategy were the most important bits, but it was really ballooning that out to really, have we got the right people, the right skills, and the right culture. And that goes back to the last 15 years or so in rooms revenue management as rooms revenue evolved. I then started to apply those same kind of principles to meetings and events. And one of the things that I discovered, particularly on the meetings and events side, is I could train and coach all of the process and all the strategy and have the tools. But if the culture was missing in the organization for the focus on meetings and events, it just wasn't going to happen. It was an uphill battle. So just to give an overview of how we're going to go through the next few minutes is I'm going to flip that on its head, and I want to start talking initially about culture and how important that is in getting meetings and events strategy off the ground and really embedded into the organization, and what that means for people, and then come on a little bit to the strategy and process. So I wanted to keep this fairly general. It's not a revenue management lesson in meetings and events, but we will cover a lot of those kind of principles and basic things that you can do, and some kind of tips and tricks and things that you can take away. But really, if we haven't got the culture of the organization right, then and senior management behind the importance and the value of meetings and events, then it really is an uphill struggle. So let's start off with culture, and I can really demonstrate why I say that. I, some years ago, in my smart space days, was sitting across a table from a senior vice president of revenue and marketing for an international hotel chain, and starting to talk about meetings and events. And I was completely floored when the response came back across the table of, we only have meeting rooms to support our bedroom sales. And I came to realize that that wasn't an isolated opinion. I think there's an awful lot of senior hotel people out there who will pay lip service to meetings and events, but actually ultimately the focus is so much on bedrooms, and all of the focus on what can be got out of the conference space is about how we support residential conference rooms. That's not always true, and I'm going to be very generalistic, and I know there are some great hotels and great companies out there that have really definitely started to go down the journey of embracing the value of their meeting space. And of course, it depends on how big and how important conference hotels are to their chains. But it's certainly not an isolated feeling. And I think until we can really change that culture to understand the really strong value in many cases of what can be gleaned from meetings and event space in its own right, it's still going to be it's still a lot of work to do. So just a few highlights on that. One is, from a cultural organization, even if you're an independent hotel, it's making sure that in that management structure there is a commitment to meetings and event space in its own right. And we'll explore why that's important and how you can quantify that or justify that. It's really taking it apart from rooms and looking at what space there is, what the capacity of that space is, what the revenue value of that space is, and then bringing it back together. Of course, we want to use the meeting space to fill rooms, but what you find so often is that there's actually far more meeting space than there are bedrooms. I work with many hotels, and just to give you kind of a rough breakdown, rough average, you could have a 200 bedroom hotel with 600 delegate spaces or more. And so having that focus on driving residential meetings business for the bedrooms leaves a whole world of space unexplored and unfilled. We find sales teams focus a lot on residential business and not so much on those really important day delegates and how you fill the rest of the space once you've got the bedrooms. So it's really looking separately at that meetings event space, understanding the value of it. And one of the things that's often missing is the driver of that. We often find in corporate offices, there is a head of sales and marketing, there's a director of revenue, there's a director of food and beverage, there's directors at very senior level who look at group functions, and very, very rarely do you find someone who holds responsibility for meetings and events at a corporate level. It usually kind of just fits maybe somewhere under, or it's a bit of an afterthought. And one of the first steps to really driving revenue, and the companies that have done this have really seen the benefits of it, is having someone at that top table who is looking at meetings and events in its own right. And the organization structure flows from that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in a hotel level in a moment, but it's actually saying, well, where does this fit? Because many people will see it as a food and beverage function, an operational banqueting kind of role. Some will see it as part of sales. Rarely does it sit as part of revenue. That's starting to happen more and more, but revenue managers often struggle to engage with meetings and events. They kind of feel it's all function sheets and AV equipment, and don't necessarily engage well with the commercial aspects of meetings and events. Again, I'm being very generalistic. That's not entirely true across the board, but it is a major factor. And there's other things that come into that, which again, I'll touch on. And this is one of the biggest challenges. Is the reason it's not looked at is who owns the result? Who actually owns the numbers that are attached to that meeting space? Very often meetings and events revenue gets diluted into restaurant revenue because all the delegates have lunch in the restaurant. So the F&B manager is really interested in that part of the revenue, but actually having someone accountable for the revenue that comes out of that function space, not bedroom revenue, just delegate revenue, room hire, all of those things. Of course, there's a budget, but usually it ends up being the sales manager running the inquiry office, and numbers are kind of, often you find the accountant's the one that's actually putting through the M&E numbers because there's no one else to do it. And so having someone own that part of the budget, own that result, and actually strategize, forecast effectively would again make that result far better. We tend to kind of sit and accept what comes out of meetings and events as opposed to driving the opportunity. And that also requires technology investment. We spend huge amounts of money on PMS systems, on revenue management systems, on distribution systems. The investment in sales and catering and any kind of strategy tool for meetings and events is often lags behind. And I have to say there's actually very few options for obviously good diary management systems, but anything else around meetings and events tends to be focused on, when you see new software coming out, it tends to be about event management. So it tends to be about delegates registering and how do you manage the whole event process, as opposed to hotel strategy. And again, because it's not being driven by the C-suite, if you like, the demands in the industry aren't making it happen. There's been some great innovations, I have to say, with new diary management systems, sales and catering systems, and also online distribution systems. So things are moving forward, things are getting better, but they're actually often being driven by the companies that are developing them rather than the hotel operators asking for what they need. Having a really strategic approach to meetings and events is again, it kind of comes under this whole umbrella of the organization driving that culture, demanding more strategic approach, demanding good data, demanding good forecasting and good business practice. And so often it's just left to just fade away. It's not high on the agenda. And this is one of my real passions. I know hotels are, largely bedrooms, and many hotels don't have big conference space, but many do have significant conference space. And still, as an industry, we talk about everything in terms of bedrooms, even terms like TrevPAR, which I have to say, as a revenue manager, is great because we're looking beyond RevPAR, we're looking beyond rooms, but it's still per available room. And almost every measure you see in the States, they have this great measure called Roger, which is revenue per occupied guest room. And so it's all the catering revenue per occupied guest room. Everything is done as a measure based on the number of bedrooms. And until we stop looking at that way, and look at space in its own right, and maybe start looking at revenue per space, or different kinds of measures, we won't get away from this bedroom obsession. So those are some of the things in culture that I think are really important in order to drive forward, in order to allow those in the M&E teams, in sales, in operations, to really do their best and deliver their best, is that those sorts of things at an organizational level are really important.
Heather, can I maybe interrupt you there? Just a couple of things. One of the things that you and I talked about was sort of that even if someone does own that revenue in that M&E space, in the revenue meetings, they're kind of left to the end, and it's while everyone is kind of gathering up their papers that we go, oh, how much did we make, and what does that look like? As you say, it's usually down to function sheets and things like that. But do you think a revenue manager can actually influence that culture, or do you think that has to come from the top down? So I guess that's question number one. And then we've had a question from Amy saying, are there any particular M&E systems that you would recommend, standalone systems, I guess?
Okay, both great questions. I'll do the revenue manager one first. Unfortunately, I think genuinely, yes, I think revenue managers can influence their organizations. However, it's almost a step back from that, in that we need to influence revenue managers. I talk to a lot of revenue managers, and many of them engage and really want to understand meetings and events. Many of them go, no, not me. I don't do meetings and events. I do rooms. And there's good reasons for that. Generally speaking, revenue managers are only targeted on rooms results. They're not targeted on total revenue. They're not targeted on meetings and events. Data is another massive issue. And again, we'll come on to that when we talk a little bit about process. But one of the reasons that revenue managers don't really engage with meetings and events is they don't have good data. And revenue managers are all about analysis, demand, forecasting. And for that, you need good data. So we'll come back, I'll come back on that. But I think genuinely, one of the things I've tried to do over the last 5-6 years is create this groundswell of excitement and interest in meetings and events, and hope that kind of works its way up the organizations. And in some cases that's worked really well, and in other cases it's only made a dent. And so I think the more people who understand the possibility and understand the opportunity, because that's the bit that's missing, is how you can get into influence those organizations. So I'd love to say yes, revenue managers, absolutely, they have a lot of influence in the business, but it's also influencing general managers, it's influencing regional directors. It's you kind of have to attack it from lots of different levels.
Great.
And systems. So there's some really good property management. I mean, everybody knows Opera Sales and Catering and Delphi development, but the systems like Ivy, there's a good 8 to 10 sales and catering systems, depending on your needs. Some are much more sophisticated than others. It's really about what you do. All of those systems track data. Yeah. So all of those systems, no matter how simple, no matter how complex, provide good booking data. And one of the bigger challenges is not so much what system you use, it's how you use it. So you can have the most sophisticated system, and if bookings aren't going in the system with the right data, that's one of the biggest challenges. So I'm very pleased in terms of the developments of integration with live inventory. And I'll come on to live inventory because I get very nervous about live inventory. Great for small meeting rooms, short lead, but my ballroom that breaks into 7 rooms, I would be very nervous about putting that in. That's me personally. I'm a bit of a dinosaur in that respect. But I love the fact that, the majority of so many bookings are for less than 30 people. So yes, why not get that inventory online, making sure you're past the point of demand where you need those rooms for breakouts, for bigger events, that kind of stuff. But those technologies definitely have grown in the last 4 or 5 years. There's several good live online bookings. Often though, they don't integrate. They really need to integrate. There's a few that do, because you don't want to be managing 2 sets of inventory and rates. Think back 15 years to when rooms started to go online, and you were managing all the intranets and all the distribution systems and having to do it separately. To try and do that with meetings and events availability is just a non-starter. So they are coming about, but it's really having the technology, and still that we don't have revenue management systems for meetings and events. Putting live inventory out there is always going to be a challenge or a bit of a scary prospect, but it's being done, and it's being done slowly and cautiously, so that's good.
I just want to let you know that there's some questions in here. Katie, Ayana, Peter and Claire have all asked specific questions around metrics. I'm lucky enough to have seen your presentation, so I know what's coming. So I'm going to bank those, and then guys, if for any reason as we get to the end, if we haven't answered anything specific, please jump back in again. But I know that you have a lot around data and statistics and measurement, Heather, so I'll let you go on.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly run through people, and it's again, it just follows on from that culture of, and I just want to reiterate again that corporate stakeholder, or even at property level. What are the reporting lines on property? So, does meetings and events come into the sales team? Does it come under the food and beverage team, the revenue team, or the banqueting team? It's kind of that. In many different hotels, it arrives in many different places. I think it's moved more from being the banqueting office 10, 15 years ago to being part of the sales team. It may have some influence from revenue, but I'd say probably more often than not, it's now coming under sales. But that's, again, it's really difficult to tell because there's so many different arrangements. And that's really important, because if you don't really have a home, it's a little bit like in many years gone by, the reservations team was purely the back office of the front desk. It was just seen as an admin team. And although we've moved on from there, it's still, in many hotels, it still comes under the banqueting department, and is therefore more worried about what you're delivering to the customer, which of course is very important, but rather than being strategic. So you don't push capacities, you don't really forecast demand, pricing's often very flat, because no one with that strategic mind is really pushing the commercial side of that business. So it's really important where those lines are, and I wouldn't default, coming back to kind of what we were saying earlier, I wouldn't default necessarily to the revenue team, because unless you have a revenue manager who's really open to getting engaged with that function space in its own right, not just what we can do with the bedrooms, it's still a challenge. I've had so many conversations with meetings and event sales managers who constantly fight with the revenue manager, because in order to get a residential conference, the revenue manager is pushing for another 10, 15 pounds on the average rate. And meanwhile, you say goodbye to a booking that has a £50 day delegate and a £30 dinner, and you've lost money for the property. And that comes all the way back to who's looking at that total revenue. It's also a question of, even within the team, within the events, what I would call the event sales team, there are so many different skill sets. I'm going to kind of lump the two next ones together. Is what do you expect of that team? Because many people will see that team as the admin team to the operations. Some will see it as a sales team. Strategy kind of comes in there somewhere. If you've got a very clued in event sales manager, they'll really get to grips with pricing and so on. And there's also the event planning side. So there's all those function sheets, and there's all the detail of that AV equipment and of that planning, and spending the 20 minutes with the bride's mother talking about the color of napkins. It's such a broad spectrum through that whole function. I always try and engage where hotel teams are big enough that that function is split. So you have a team that does inquiry handling and conversion, and really focuses on getting the right price, doing the strategy, answering the inquiries, and chasing, getting those contracts signed. And then it's handed over to an event planning team who do that detail, who understand how to run functions, whether they're banqueting functions, whether they're meetings, but have that eye to detail. Where you're asking one person to do that whole thing, and often meet and greet on the day, that's a huge, huge task for a team of people that are often under-resourced, underpaid. And again, therefore, that's often why hotels have poor outcomes, in meetings and events, and it's a vicious circle. If you only, turn over X thousand pounds a year and you don't expect that to grow, other than an annual, you're not going to drive that strategy if you haven't got the right people doing it. And just finally, that accountability and authority. Space management needs its own drivers and its own people making decisions and having the authority to make decisions about that space. One of the things I found when I was working in the States is you have the groups team, which is part of the sales team, often has control of the diary because they want to sell the ballroom up until, and the events team doesn't even have access to that space to sell. And then it ends up either unsold or undersold because there isn't a strategy involved in it. So that role, there needs to be somebody who is a champion of that meetings and events at property level, who is empowered to make decisions and drive the business, whether that's the revenue manager, sales, whoever that role is. And that kind of brings us on to the strategy side. And so this is kind of where the guts is of the activity, I guess. And the number one thing for me that is kind of lacking in the industry, because often I do this in presentations and you can kind of see the light bulbs going on, but it still doesn't necessarily ring true in how you use that day to day, is really understanding the value of space. And I'm going to demonstrate that in a little bit, but one of the things that I simply do is take space, look at the number of delegate spaces you have, look at a value, an average value per head, and suddenly you can come out with a daily total. You can understand what that space is worth, regardless of rooms, regardless of any additional revenue, what that space is worth on a daily basis. And once you have that, you can start to measure against it. And again, I'll expand that in a little bit later on. So this is where I'm glad we had those questions on measurements, KPIs. The industry is very lacking. Again, that's one of the challenges. We all know about RGI and ADR and all the RevPAR and all the lovely measurements there are for bedrooms. There's very few standard industry measures for meetings and events. For me, I'm actually going to add another one to that I haven't put on the screen, are the most vital ones. And number one is delegate density. And the reason I focus so much on delegate density is if you drive your delegate density up, and I'll explain what I mean by delegate density in a second, it's really looking at what space do I have available and how many people am I getting in that space. You will drive revenue far more than price. If you just take a boardroom that holds 20 people, whether I have 10 people in that boardroom or 15 people in that boardroom, that's a 50% revenue growth. So if I have 10 people at £50, I've made £500. If I have 15 people at £5, that's £750. I've suddenly made an additional £250, which doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it's a 50% revenue growth. And so focusing on my delegate capacity against what my opportunity is it's a bit like focusing on bedroom occupancy. You drive up revenue. But that's obviously not the be all and end all. Revenue per square meter is a really simple commercial measure. But the challenge is we don't sell by revenue per square meter. So it's very hard if you're working in the team and you're looking at, how am I going to drive revenue? I'm not sitting there working out revenue per square meter. But if I concentrate on my pricing and my delegate density, the revenue per square meter will take care of itself. So it's a great measure to have to see how well you're doing and how well you're growing. But it's not a workable one that you can set a strategy to effectively. And the third one that I would say that I haven't put up there is conversion of revenue. So looking at all of the inquiries that you have and looking what percentage of those inquiries, not inquiries did you convert, but revenue did you convert? And it's really interesting, whenever you ask a property what's their conversion rate, if they know it at all, they know the conversion of number of inquiries. If you ask conversion of revenue, often either they won't tell you or they don't know. And of course, that relies on making sure every inquiry is tracked, because you also have to track the ones that you lose and the ones that you turn away in order to understand what your revenue conversion is. So hotels that have a 80% revenue conversion, I can pretty much instantly guarantee you that all the bookings aren't going in the system. They're only putting bookings in the system when those bookings confirm. In reality, it's generally somewhere between 17 and 25% revenue conversion, which sounds appalling, but actually it's, you know, when you look at the volume of inquiries, it's really about how do I drive that forward? It doesn't matter where you start, it's how do I improve my booking selection, my delegate numbers, how do I drive up my conversion of revenue? And that's where you can see that growth. So it doesn't matter if you have a quiet month or a busy month, it doesn't matter if you're a small hotel or a big hotel. Conversion of the opportunities you were offered is really one of the best ways of understanding how well you're doing. And that's, you know, kind of just restates one of the biggest frustrations through working through all this data, through bringing kind of tools to hotels to understand and analyze their data in meetings and events. This is the biggest stumbling block. The number of either bookings that weren't put in the system at all, or bookings that are put in the system with no revenue attached, because the revenue that gets added when we do the function sheet. So that means only bookings that have converted get revenue attached. So you can't measure or see all the revenue that you lost or the revenue that you turned away. Or we don't put the right number of delegates in, or all those bookings that were lost we didn't have time to put in, so we kind of caught up a couple of weeks later and we got them in the system with basic data, so your lead time is gone. So if there's one thing that I could really, everything comes from this. This is the biggest foundational aspect of being able to have a revenue strategy, is making sure that every single booking is captured, everyone that's turned away. And I know I've worked in busy M&E offices, so I know how frustrating it is when you're really busy and the phone's ringing and the chef is screaming at you and you've got to go to a meeting and you've got function sheets to get out, to actually spend 2 or 3 minutes to put a booking in that you've just turned away. But what you won't know next year is, what was my opportunity? I filled space, but I had 17 other inquiries for that day. That builds your strategy, and unless you're recording those inquiries, you will never know and never be able to make better decisions and better selections. And then we get into the revenue management bit. So once we've got that data, we start to analyze that data in all kinds of different ways, looking at demand by day, looking at demand by number of delegates, looking at lead time, pace, all those good things that we're so used to looking at in bedrooms, and therefore being able to forecast demand more effectively. So often, again, when I kind of come into properties for the first time, you say, well, what's your pricing strategy? And often it's, well, January, February, March, it's this, because that's the low season. And April, May, and June is pretty good for conferencing, so it's goes up a bit. And it's this kind of blanket strategy. And unless you can actually really look at your historic demand patterns and forecast those patterns, interestingly, very often when I do that exercise, you look at the 3rd week or the 4th week of January in many years, and it's just as busy as a week in June. You've got to break those things down week by week and really look for those patterns, and then set your strategy accordingly, in exactly the same way we do that for bedrooms. And again, this comes back to, you know, so often in meetings, events, it's the pricing is flat. It's just you've got a day delegate rate, or you might have a high, medium, low day delegate rate, but there's very little analysis goes into when you offer what rate. So often we're still led by the client's budget. I should have prefaced at the very beginning, and I apologize for not doing this. I know we're in the middle of COVID, we're in the middle of lockdowns and shutdowns and everything else. So I do just want to interject here and say I'm talking really in general about meetings and event strategy. It will come back, and we'll talk at the end about the impacts of COVID and what's happening as we come out of it. But these things all hold true. So even though we've had a year and a half of really wacky demand patterns or no demand patterns, patterns from previous years will still be useful and will still come back. It's going to take a while, but even being able to look forward at the business on the books and start to build a pattern from that, look at all of those inquiries that you've had, that will start to build those demand patterns, and you can start to see where the peaks and troughs are. So all I'm talking about now, I know you're probably sitting there going, well, we just don't have any business, so how can we be doing dynamic pricing and so on? It all matters, because And as as we talked about, demand is starting to build, and you are making decisions for the back end of this year and into next year and onwards. And you don't just want to be quoting rack, and you don't just be wanting to quote the cheapest rate because you need to build the business back. You can get those strategies going now. Start to build them, start to build those demand patterns. I've got in there by room and by number of delegates. And this is a real subject that's very, very close to my heart, where the difference with meetings and events is it matters how many people you have in a room. So with bedroom sales, you either sell for one person, two people, or occasionally you might have family rooms. Having how many people there are in a room is really important. And knowing which of your rooms are the most popular is really important. So starting to understand demand by size, and again, I'll come and say a little bit more about this, is important, because you then start to understand which are your most popular spaces and which spaces you can charge more for. And that then drives your pricing and drives your delegate numbers as well. Talked a little bit about live inventory. It is the way of the future. It is happening. Again, one of the joys to me about when I kind of moved over from many years of managing bedrooms, one of the things I found most interesting and fascinating is the jigsaw puzzle of meetings and events. So where you might have 8 main rooms, you might end up with 20 subrooms, child rooms, whatever you want to call them. And the jigsaw puzzle of fitting inquiries to space so that you're maximizing space, to me, is the challenge. Quoting price is, it's fairly basic stuff, but actually using that space to its best availability is the bit that really makes the difference. And that's quite difficult to do with live inventory, as I've already touched on. But it definitely has its place. So I've worked with many kind of airport hotels that have 20 syndicate rooms. Well, with the best one in the world, you're very rarely going to need those for a big event. So there are certain times definitely where getting that live inventory out for small rooms, even if it's only just room hire, is useful. And it also puts you on the in the window, if you like, of shopping, because if you've got businesses that are booking on these live inventory booking systems, they're seeing you, they're seeing your property. So when that bigger inquiry comes along, even if they can't book it through live inventory, they know you. So it's worth engaging with those systems, but you've got to be very careful how you're managing them. Technology is going to become more and more and more important, because as we know, again, coming out of COVID, resources are going to be scarce. And the more efficient we can be with technology, having everything in the system. So often I work with hotels where there's an Excel spreadsheet, even though everything's in the system, they're still running a manual Excel spreadsheet because they don't trust the system, or because all the information isn't in the system. So forecasting, that extra bar spend, those sorts of things can all be done in your diary management system. But so often, because all of that data is not there, we kind of feel more comfortable with that Excel spreadsheet, and so we're doing things twice. But the more we can use the technology we've got, the more efficient we'll become, and the better the data, and the whole thing just improves. So yes, we need new technologies, but actually we really need to use the technology we've got much better. And this is the comment I think you'll make again, Joanna, on revenue meetings. You're right. We've all sat there. We've done the rooms. That's even if the meetings and events manager gets invited to the revenue meeting. Often it's right. Well, the function space meetings, your meeting, and often M&E revenue isn't even discussed, or if it is, it's right at the end of the meeting. But I kind of have this mantra. So many hotels will say to me, "Well, it's only 10% of our revenue. It's only 15% of our revenue. It's not that's not what we should be focusing on." It'll only ever be 10% if you only ever give it that amount of time. And once you do that exercise of really understanding the value of space, that's when you start to become you start to understand the opportunity. So you really start to say, okay, maybe we do need to give this more time and attention. And again, that comes all the way back to culture. It's having the right people in place. It's having the right systems and strategy in place. It's having the time to analyze that information and really seeing what's possible. Not what have we always done, and let's stick another 3% or 5% on it. It's about what's possible and how do we go about fulfilling that potential. So unless you commit to that time and those resources, it will never grow.
I completely agree with you, Heather. And I think, we here at Right Revenue, we talk about useful data all the time, not big data. Get rid of that myth. We want useful data that you can make decisions on. But that useful data hinges around what you're getting out of the system. And I think there's a great quote of, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And that's true. You can only react to stuff that you can measure. And I think measuring the way that we do in rooms within that meeting and event space is critical as we go forward, because we know it's coming back, and we have evidence of that. I just have one question here from Emma. Will there ever be a time when our meeting room system will link to live distribution systems, so we will leave updating the space behind us? This is the biggest detrimental time factor to showing availability from meeting rooms online. Do you think that is coming?
So that's already here. It is here. And the name of the company now escapes me. In fact, I think there's 2 or 3, but I can't think of his name now either. That's really terrible. I should have that on the tip of my tongue. There is a company, Scandinavian company, that distributes meetings and events and interfaces with opera sales and catering. I think Ivy likewise does. They're kind of end to end. So you can live book, you can distribute and live book through their system right into your diary management system. So it is here. There aren't many of them. And then of course you have Delphi interfaces with the likes of Starsight and gosh, my brain's gone now.
This might prompt you, Heather. We've got Venue Directory, do live availability meetings package. And there's quite a few meetings package, or there's a lot of people throwing that in. So I'm not sure if that's the company you're talking about. But
yes, meetings package is what I was thinking of, but likewise the vendor. And yeah, so they are out there now. But again, you still have to manage. There's the bit that's missing. So the reason that rooms inventory went online, live inventory, I remember I was a revenue manager back in the day before the internet, actually, before hotels.com, lastminute.com.
You and Mo both.
And when they started, you were having to manage through third portals, or you were managing through their own extranet. So you were managing 7 or 8 different sites. I remember the days when GDS got integrated to PMS systems. So you were then having live inventory distribution. But what really made that easy were the revenue management systems. When Ideas came along and all the other guys came along, and you could actually not have to worry about everything got connected and your strategy was there as well. And so you just manage your strategy and you check the levers. With meetings and events, you've got the diary management system, you've got the online distribution systems coming in now. The bit that's missing is the revenue management system that's going to help. One of the things SmartSpace started to do was at least be able to send a strategy, if not an availability. So if you get availability, you could then say, okay, well, my strategy is this price for this room on this day. But in a very, very basic way. So, it's not the revenue management systems, meetings, events. It's not an easy thing. There are so many things to take into account when trying to divine an automated strategy for M&E. So that's the bit that's missing. So until we have that, yes, live inventory is out there, which is why I kind of, it's that caution of saying, well, which of my rooms am I happy to free sell out there to the world? Which ones do I really need to kind of hold back and go, yeah, I'm not sure the ballroom's the right one to go out there and have anybody be able to book it at any point, even if I stick a big price tag on it, because the strategy of that space management's really important. Okay, should we move on?
Perfect, thanks, Heather.
So I just really quickly want to ask that question. How do we think about the value of function space? If you want to go away after this session and just calculate the value of your function space, how are you going to do it? You can do it in 5 minutes. It's really simple. And I'll come back to that in just one second. This always amuses me or distresses me. I'm not sure which way to look at it these days, but if you were to go to a GM, as I go into hotels, or a sales manager or a front office manager or even a chambermaid in the corridor, and you ask them how many bedrooms do you have in a hotel, they'll always be able to tell you. Everyone can tell you. It's how we kind of identify ourselves. That everyone knows exactly how many bedrooms there are. And if you ask generally anyone of the management team or anyone who attends the morning meeting, what was your occupancy last night? They'll generally be able to tell you that too, because it comes out in the morning meeting. We talk about, you know, and same with average rate. You know, those are things that we are so ingrained in us. But if you ask a GM or anyone in the senior management team, what was your delegate occupancy yesterday? How well did you use your function space? I have yet to find a senior manager in a hotel that can tell me an answer to that question. Again, it comes back to this: we don't take our meeting space seriously. We don't look at it in its own right as its own profit center or revenue generator. So how do we do that? Let's just look at I'm just going to do this really quickly, but look at a typical hotel's function space capacity. So all I've got here is the room chart, is the layout. And you can see each of the rooms there, and overlaid over each room is a number. And what that number is, it's the capacity of that space. And you can see where the ballrooms are that break down into 3 sections. I want the whole capacity of the room. I don't want to look at the individual capacities, because the best way to sell a room to optimize its space is to sell the full room. Of course, sometimes you have to break it down, but the optimal capacity is going to be the full space. And what I haven't done here is taken theatre style. I never see any point in measuring meetings and event space by theatre style, because it's an unrealistic target. We don't sell our space. Occasionally we do, of course, but generally speaking, we don't sell our space theatre style. It's generally cabaret or classroom in most meeting setups. Obviously, in the smaller rooms, it's often boardroom or U-shape. So the numbers I've taken here is what's the next best thing to theatre style. So I look at my capacity chart and I look at cabaret or classroom. Often U-shape gets a few more people in the boardroom. And I take that number. So you can see over there on the right, the Continental Ballroom, I can get 270 people in classroom style. And so on. And all I do is just add up those numbers for each room. And just at the bottom there, you can see the total classroom capacity of all of my space is 730 delegates. And now I have a measure. Now I have a gauge that every single day, just like my number, equate that to the number of bedrooms you have in the hotel. So if I've got 200 bedrooms in the hotel, I've got 730 delegate spaces. And every day I can see what was my occupancy. Now that could be a banquet, it could be a meeting, it could be an exhibition, it could be whatever. But I have a measure to measure against. And I'm not looking at this in day parts. I'm not going to go, wow, well, I've got 730 spaces 4 times a day, because you're getting overcomplicated. My absolute mantra is keep it simple, start basic, get those measures, and then you can get as complicated as you like further down the road. But if you just start with the opportunity of selling that space once a day to an optimum capacity, now I can measure. So it doesn't matter whether I have 50 people in yesterday, 500 people in, or maybe I did sell some of that space twice and I actually got 850 people in. Well, that's great. I'm over 100% occupancy. And it's as simple as that. And now, of course, we want to attach a revenue value. So let's say we've got an average day delegate spend of £50 per person. Now, this may be in your hotel £35, it may be £135, whatever is your general spend. And don't take rack rate, take what you realistically sell at, go slightly above it. Because you always want to have that little bit of a stretch. So all we take is our 730 people at £50. And now we have a daily revenue target. So sometimes I'm going to go above that. Sometimes I'm going to go below it. But I can see a realistic daily revenue target of £36,500 for all my function space. So now I can get a daily revenue yield. Maybe I only made £8,000 last night. Maybe I did £50,000. I can measure that on a daily basis. So now I can start to see how I'm doing against my opportunity. And it's that simple. It literally takes minutes to figure that out. The key is then measuring it on a daily basis and talking about it, having it become part of the revenue meeting or part of the morning meeting. so that actually that starts to become ingrained as being an important contribution. One of the things I'm just going to throw in here is a slight bugbear of mine is what you often find with the daily delegate rate when it breaks down is you might have 30 to 50% of it is room hire, the rest is food and beverage, and that's nice and simple. When it becomes a 24-hour rate, somehow the room hire amount kind of disappears. So many hotels I work with, once that becomes 24-hour, you take out all the food and beverage allocations and everything else goes to bedrooms. And that simply isn't fair. And I understand why, because everyone's focused on RGI and ADR and RevPAR and all of that good stuff. But actually, that's room hire revenue. You've got to service the room. It's revenue for that space. And if you're going to take meetings and events seriously to understand the value of the space and what you're getting from that space, then you have to apportion revenue accordingly. That's also one of the reasons it's really hard to get standard industry KPIs, because there's no standard to the way things are done. Just before I leave this slide, just coming on to the last couple, is this hotel has 250 bedrooms. So 730 delegate spaces, 250 bedrooms. If I sold those 250 bedrooms at £180, I made 45,000. And now you can start to see the revenue potential of rooms versus meeting space is really, the gap's not that big. If we were really meeting the potential, and bear in mind, that's not at theatre style, it's not at rack rate of the DDR, that's a realistic total of that 36,500. If I'm using my space, if I have the right demand, but at least I have a benchmark that I can measure against.
I think that's
so hopefully
fantastic. That's, yeah, no, it is. Heather, sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you there. I just had a good point from Mark. I just wondered if you had any comment on that. So that measurement that you've just given us there, 36,000, should we be also measuring revenue versus profit? So if, let's say, one delegate company wants to come in and pay the equivalent of 730 delegates at £50, so the revenue achieved is still 36,000, but there's more profit because you're looking after one client. I guess what you're saying is start with something simple and then look at these other measurements as you get kind of really confident about it.
Because there's so many things. Syndicate rooms are always the big one. And people say, well, I've got 10 syndicate rooms, and so if I sell my main suite to 300 people, they're going to use those syndicate rooms. I don't want to count those people twice. Absolutely. But you want to count the revenue. So there's lots of little anomalies of how you can, if you do sell the space twice and all those sorts of things, it just gives you a benchmark. It's a way of getting it's almost back of a cigarette packet. It's just giving you a benchmark. At the moment, there's nothing. So start simple, start with a basic number. You can get really sophisticated, if you want to, but it's got to relate to what the guys in the meetings office can sell. And it's it's got to be realistic. I've worked with hotels that have gone, well, we want to have 4 day parts. And so we're going to multiply that number by 4. Maybe not the revenue number, because obviously the day delegate comes, but then you're making life complicated, and you end up coming up with 0.17% and it's meaningless, so nobody pays attention to it. So start really simple, and if you find that 2 days out of 7 you're exceeding that target, that's okay, that's good. If you find that 5 days out of 7 you're exceeding that target, up the target. Yeah. It's a benchmark, but make it real and make it mean something.
Yeah, I think if you're doing something, it's better than doing nothing. So if that measurement is going to make you more educated about your business today, then that's a great place to start. And our lovely friend Jane has said, Heather is a master at making something complex look super simple. It is simple, but very clever. And you're absolutely right, Jane. I back that up. I've just one question. It's a bit of a side swipe, Heather, but I thought you might know. Someone has just asked, is there something like an OTA insight or at the edge, of competitor rate shopping that tells you how your competitors are doing in meetings and event space?
There is rate shopping. There isn't really, and I may be a little bit out of touch with this. There used to be hot stats for measuring, comparing, but again, most of the stats about meetings and events were related to number of bedrooms. There was a great little tool called, and it's even, the name of that's even gone, but it's not around anymore. There needs to be something. So there's rate shopping, but there's also performance. And there are a few things out there, but nothing that's really could gain enough traction across all of the different chains to make it viable. And it's also the conference bench, it was the thing that came closest, and it was really nice and simple, and it was about, just give food, beverage, room hire revenues. It was all anonymized. Yes, it's similar to StarSac, but it couldn't get enough of the main chains to get enough of competitor sets in enough locations. It's desperately needed. I got asked a lot about that one as part of Smart Space. But no, it doesn't. And again, that goes all the way back to the industry isn't driving for it to the to the people that can make it happen at a senior level.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Claire's just asked, I guess, the same thing. And it's a little bit difficult of, if you, let's say, brand new build, the £50 DDR is a bit of a, we think we're going to do this.
Yep.
And I guess it's exactly the same with an average room rate in a hotel. You kind of have to take a punt of what you think either your room space is worth, what people are willing to pay, or what your competitors are charging, just to give you an idea as and a benchmark to start from. It may change in 3 months or 6 months, but I think having that initial figure just to start the measurement is really important. And don't write it in stone. Be prepared to be flexible and change that.
Absolutely, and it should never be written down. I mean, that price to me is an average, because it should definitely vary depending on your demand level. It should definitely vary depending on how popular each room is. It shouldn't be as driven as it is by the client budget. I know that's always an important thing, but and with competitor sets, as with rooms, it's not just about the locality. It's also about, particularly for events where you might be up against, you might be selling Birmingham and you might be up against Edinburgh, London and Brighton, so it's also looking at the style of the property, the style of the business it's doing, and so on.
Yeah.
Adrienne, I'm really conscious on time. I apologize. I've kind of gone a little bit slow, so I'm just going to throw these up here. I think I've got one more slide after this, and hopefully time for a few questions.
Perfect.
So in terms of process, and we covered kind of a lot of this, but number one thing is identify that up to capacity, identify optimum revenue for that space. Look at demand by number of delegates and lead time. And number of delegates for me is break it down into categories of 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. Because so many times when I've done this with hotels, all the focus is on filling the ballroom, and yet the vast majority of inquiries are for less than 20 people. And that tells me a thing about pricing. That tells me we should be pricing our smaller rooms more per head than the ballroom. And depending, obviously, there's lots of caveats to that, but if you understand that demand profile, it will help you in your not just pricing, but also holding out that example I gave earlier about the boardroom. Whether I get 10 people or 12 people or 15 people or 18 people makes a huge difference to my revenue. So if I know I've got much more demand for my smaller rooms, I can really drive for capacity. Whereas the ballroom, maybe I never get inquiries for 400 people, so I'm going to have to settle for 250 people. But it's using that data to make those strategies. Forecasting demand is the biggest. Again, I go and look at demand calendars in meetings and events hotels, and it's either all the same color, or every weekend and every midweek is it's just all the way through the year. You have the data, that data sat, all of that demand data, if you've captured the data, is sat in your meetings and events system. You can get it out. You can get it out in a data dump. You can either use Excel tools, you can use pivot tables, you can use a tool like SmartSpace. There's things out there, but it doesn't have to be complicated. It's just making sure you're using that data to look at those patterns. Price by demand, popularity, space, focus on maximizing delegate numbers. We covered those. I just wanted to touch again on measuring conversion with focus on lost and turn down. So many hotels, again, haven't really got time to go into it, but the lessons that so many hotels have learned once they've had access to that data and realized the value and the reasons why they're turning away business, and learning from that makes a huge difference, of an actual tangible difference to revenue. And have that daily review of that delegate entity and revenue, Neil. So just finally, touch on the COVID. Again, you guys will know, you're seeing your booking patterns coming in. But the one thing, prior to COVID, my mantra has always been, pack them in, use your space effectively, focus on your delegate capacity. Clearly, life has changed. I just threw that little picture up on the slide to make everyone feel just slightly uncomfortable, because I think whenever you see a picture like that now, it's like, oh, they're a bit too close together. But just, think about how you can creatively use your space, and that's all of your space, including maybe the front hall or the, areas that you don't normally use as, or think of as, meeting and function space. But reevaluate that. It's a great time to do it with, obviously we've got social distancing, obviously I've seen some great pictures online, things that hotels are doing. You can see the new layouts, you can see the distancing. So if your room that used to hold 40 people now actually only holds 18 people, fine, that's your new target. Don't let it for 12 people. Make sure you're getting 15 or 18 people in there. Make sure, dependent on demand, obviously, that you're actually maximizing that space as far as you possibly can. Visually promote those measures. I've been, as I say, very impressed when I've seen walkthroughs on video, or I've seen a lot of good visual. I can see what I'm going, I can see where the hand sanitizers are, I can see what that would make me buy. That would help me to make that decision to go, okay, my guys are going to be safe, we're going to have a good meeting. The more people can see that visually, the better. We know we're going to have reduced manpower. Sadly, we know, come back. I mean, prior to COVID, M&E teams were often very understaffed. That's not going to go away for quite a while. So look at your process, look at efficiency, look at how can we make sure everything gets in the system, and use our time effectively. Let the customers see, generate those automated contracts, don't be writing Word documents, all that kind of stuff. Keep things clear, keep it simple. Clients when they've got choices, don't put barriers in their way. I'm not saying don't have terms and conditions, of course you need to protect the business, but don't make it complicated. This is a big one that I'm sure many of you are already seeing, is the blended meetings. Is that maybe you don't want to bring 100 people together in one space, but having 30 people together in one space, and then having a few satellite meetings, or some people from home, event presenters dialing in, is that investing in that technology, because that is definitely something I think that is here to stay, of having that those video conferencing links as well as live meetings. But people will want to meet, be confident about your business. They will get together. I think that, Zoom has been amazing, and all the derivatives of, but people want to get together and meet face to face. There are certain things that really can be done best by being in the room. We've just got to make it safe. And with pricing, there's kind of a lot of questions coming up about pricing generally. How should we be pricing for next year and so on? Do a demand forecast. The only way you're going to be confident in your pricing is understanding what level of demand that you have. So if you have historic data, you can use that, but actually just look forward to all the inquiries, and hopefully you've tracked all the things that you've had to turn away, and all the things that are coming in now that even maybe you're losing and not converting at the moment. But use all of that data to get as realistic a forecast as possible. And that will guide your pricing decisions.
Heather, that was absolutely fascinating. I've interrupted you all the way through with the questions, so I think we've covered them, unless if anyone would like to put any. Okay, so actually we have one from Shona. With the emergence of hybrid events, will that affect pricing? So will you price higher for people who are actually physically at the event, and less for those people that are dialing in? Or what's your thoughts on that, Heather?
Interesting, really interesting question. To be fair, obviously a huge amount of the cost related to a price for delegates is the guys on property. They're getting the food, they're getting the service, they're getting the water, and so on. It's possibly difficult to justify charging a per person price for those at the end of a video call, but definitely look at a pricing for that technology, for that video call, for facilitating that video call. I'm not saying don't charge for the remote delegates, but I would think you might have a hard tussle with the customer in justifying that. But definitely, if you're, it's your broadband, it's potentially your equipment, you've got to have people to service it. I would build that into your charge for the actual video conferencing, personally.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you and I had this discussion that, yes, things are changing. Of course, things have changed because of COVID, but the actual practices of revenue management have not gone away. They have not changed. We know how to measure data. We know how delegate rooms normally behave. We know how Tuesdays in September normally behave. So I think, it was actually Michael Hayward said to me a couple of weeks ago when we spoke, a revenue manager's job is to read and learn as much and then cut through all of that to great revenue management decisions. And I think that's true. Use your data, make sure that you're recording it, start to forecast and predict, and we will get there. COVID is not going to influence everything for the rest of our lives. We just need to be smart about how we use the data. But Heather, we've gone a little bit over time. I genuinely could talk to you all day. So I probably will drag you back kicking and screaming again, because I think there's so much to learn. I was so excited about this session because it's something I'm really passionate about as well. And I think kind of working on that meeting and events data is really exciting and something that we should be doing in the future. But Heather, thank you so much for everything. It's been a pleasure. We will be sending the recording out to everyone. It is closed, so it won't be publicly available, but we will send it out to everyone who attended. So thank you so much for everyone joining today. Heather, it's been lovely to have you, and your beautiful backdrop. I'm very jealous of your lovely map. I'm very jealous of that. But Heather, thank you so much for everything. You're an inspiration as always. Thank you.
Thank you very much.